Northern Wisconsin Territory, 1879. While every homesteader raced to notch together 6-inch logs before winter, one German immigrant was still building in late September, stacking what looked like firewood. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him crazy. He cut 16-inch pieces, stove lengths that others burned for fuel, and laid them like bricks in thick lime mortar. Double walls with sawdust packed between, post and beam framing that took twice as long as standard log construction. They laughed when he built walls that looked like a stacked woodpile. Then the hard winter of 1880 hit without warning. October blizzards, temperatures 20 below zero for months, rail lines blocked, cutting off coal and supplies. Standard 6-inch log cabins couldn't hold heat. Families burned through 4 cords of wood and still woke to frost on interior walls. But that immigrant's woodpile house stayed warm with half the fuel, walls so thick they held heat through the night. When neighbors started freezing, they swallowed their pride and crowded into the house they'd mocked. Modern engineering tests now show his cordwood walls measured 3 times the insulation value of conventional log construction. What did this frontier builder understand about thermal resistance that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The wind howled across the Wisconsin clearing as Heinrich Muller stepped back from his foundation stones, wiping sawdust from his beard. It was late September 1879, and every sensible homesteader had already chinked their cabin walls against the coming cold. But Heinrich's foundation held only the skeletal frame of hewn posts and beams, waiting for walls that existed nowhere else in Door County. His neighbors had finished their cabins weeks ago, using the standard method passed down through generations of American frontier building. 6 to 8-inch diameter logs, notched at the corners, stacked horizontally with mud and moss pressed into the gaps. Simple, fast, proven. Heinrich's neighbor Johann Brennan had thrown up his 20 by 24-foot cabin in 3 weeks flat, using straight pine logs from the grove they'd cleared together that spring. But Heinrich stared at his remaining timber pile with different eyes. The good long logs, the 20 and 30-footers that Johann had used, were mostly gone, sold to the mill in Sturgeon Bay or claimed by neighbors who'd started building first. What remained were the short pieces, the crooked tops, the 14 to 18-inch stove lengths that typically ended up split for firewood. In logging camps across Ontario, Heinrich had seen French-Canadian crews build quarters from these same short pieces, laying them crosswise in mortar like oversized bricks. The walls looked strange, but stayed warm through brutal winters that killed men in poorly built shelters. Johann walked over as Heinrich began measuring his short logs with a wooden ruler. "Still planning to build that woodpile house of yours?" he called out, grinning. "Winter's coming, whether your walls are up or not." Heinrich held up a debarked tamarack round cut precisely to 16 inches. "These pieces, they are not waste," he said in his careful English. "In the camps, we made walls this thick." He spread his arms nearly 2 feet apart. "Much warmer than your thin logs." "Thin logs?" Johann laughed. "My cabin walls are 7 inches of solid pine. That's what my father built, what his father built. You're talking about stacking stove wood like a mason stacks stones. It'll fall apart first strong wind." But Heinrich had already begun his careful preparation. Through the summer, he'd cut hundreds of pieces to exact 16-inch lengths, debarked each one with a draw knife, and stacked them in the sun to season. Cedar, tamarack, and hemlock, softwoods that resisted rot and provided natural insulation. While his neighbors split similar pieces for their winter fuel supply, Heinrich treated each round like a building block, selecting for straightness and freedom from knots. The mortar mix came from experiments Heinrich had conducted behind his temporary shanty. Slaked lime from the kiln in Egg Harbor, mixed with local sand in proportions of 1 to 3, with sawdust added to lighten the mixture and provide additional insulation. He'd tested different ratios on sample walls, checking how the mortar adhered to wood and how quickly it cured in the autumn air. Johann watched skeptically as Heinrich began laying his first course. The method looked impossible, each log end set perpendicular to the wall face, with thick beads of mortar applied only to the front and back faces, leaving the center 6 to 8 inches completely hollow. That gap in the middle will let all your heat straight through, Johann observed. Might as well leave your door open. Heinrich paused in his trowel work. The gap, it fills with sawdust and lime, like a blanket inside the wall. He demonstrated, packing the center space with a mixture of sawdust and slaked lime that would deter rodents while providing insulation. In camp, the French builders, they know this makes warm walls, much warmer than solid wood. The work progressed slowly through October. Heinrich's post and beam frame provided the structure, exactly as documented in later building guides, while the cordwood masonry filled between the uprights. Each course required careful leveling, consistent mortar thickness, and precise spacing to maintain the 16-inch wall depth. A simple wooden jig helped him keep the wall thickness uniform, but the process demanded far more time than conventional log construction. Johann's wife, Martha, stopped by one afternoon, shaking her head at the unusual sight. "It looks like you're building the world's fanciest woodshed. Heinrich, my Johann had our cabin tight and warm a month ago. You'll be laying up firewood when the snow flies." Indeed, as November approached, the contrast was striking. 3 conventional log cabins stood complete in the clearing: Johann's, the Kowalski place, and old Eric Larsson's smaller structure. All showed the familiar profile of horizontal logs, saddle-notched corners, and mud chinking. Heinrich's building rose more slowly, its walls revealing neat rows of log ends like a massive honeycomb, each round carefully mortared in place. The neighbors gathered one evening to inspect Heinrich's progress. Johann poked at a protruding log end with his knife. "Looks sturdy enough," he admitted. "But Heinrich, you've built yourself a chimney, not a cabin. All those wood ends, all that mortar, heat's going to pour right out through every gap." Heinrich ran his hand along the smooth mortar joint between 2 log ends. "You think so? We make test, maybe. Your cabin, my cabin, same night, same fire. We see which stays warm." "You're on," Johann grinned. "But when you're shivering in that woodpile come January, don't say I didn't warn you." As the first serious frost approached in early October, Heinrich's cordwood house finally stood complete. 24 feet by 28 feet, with walls 16 inches thick and a steep pitched roof designed to shed snow away from the log ends. The massive stone fireplace sat in the center of the main room, not against the outer wall like conventional cabins, its thermal mass ready to store and radiate heat throughout the thick walls. The building looked undeniably strange. Where his neighbors' cabins showed the familiar lines of horizontal logs, Heinrich's structure presented walls of neat circular ends, like looking at the business end of a massive pile of cordwood. Some visitors couldn't resist the comparison. It appeared he'd simply stacked his winter fuel supply into the shape of a house. But Heinrich knew what the Canadian camp builders had discovered through hard experience. Those seemingly absurd walls, with their complex matrix of wood, mortar, and insulation, would soon prove their worth when Wisconsin's hard winter arrived to test every building method in the territory. The first hard frost arrived on October 8, 1880, 3 weeks earlier than anyone in Door County could remember. Heinrich Miller woke to find ice crystals coating the inside of his temporary shanty windows, and he knew the time had come to test his unconventional walls against Johann Brennan's conventional wisdom. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, not the brutal cold that would define the coming winter, but severe enough to reveal which building methods could truly hold heat. Heinrich walked the short distance to Johann's cabin, where smoke already poured from the chimney despite the early hour. "Johann," Heinrich called through the door, "you remember our wager about the walls. Tonight, we make the test." Johann emerged, pulling his coat tight against the morning chill. "You still think that woodpile of yours will outperform a proper log cabin? Fine. But we do this fair and square. Same conditions, same fuel, same family size." They established the rules over coffee in Johann's kitchen. Each family would load their cast iron box stoves with exactly 40 pounds of split softwood at 9 o'clock in the evening. Both men had similar stoves, similar sized families, and similar heating routines. The only variable would be the walls themselves. Heinrich would hang a spirit thermometer in his main room. Johann would do the same, and they would record temperatures at bedtime and again at first light. Martha Brennan shook her head as the men shook hands. Grown men make in bets about whose house stays warmer. Next, you'll be wagering on which way the wind blows. But Heinrich understood what the test would reveal. During his years in Canadian logging camps, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of thermal performance, how quickly a room lost its warmth after the fire died down, how much fuel it took to maintain comfort, how evenly heat distributed through a space. The thick cordwood walls represented more than just an unconventional building method. They embodied principles of heat retention that most frontier builders had never considered. That evening, both families followed their normal routines. Johann loaded his firebox with split pine, dampered the stove for overnight burning, and settled into bed with his wife and 2 children. The thermometer in his main room read 65 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 o'clock. Across the clearing, Heinrich performed identical actions in his cordwood house, noting an interior temperature of 68 degrees. The difference in wall construction became apparent long before morning. Johann's cabin, built with 7-inch pine logs laid horizontally, relied on the thermal mass of solid wood to store heat. But wood conducts heat readily along its grain, and the gaps between logs, despite careful chinking with mud and moss, allowed air movement that steadily drained warmth from the interior. The relatively thin wall provided limited resistance to heat flow, creating a direct pathway for indoor warmth to escape into the October night. Heinrich's walls operated on entirely different principles. The 16-inch thickness created multiple barriers to heat transfer. The log ends, positioned perpendicular to the wall face, forced heat to travel across the grain rather than along it, significantly slowing conduction. The mortar joints provided thermal breaks between individual pieces of wood, preventing continuous paths for heat flow. Most importantly, the sawdust and lime core in the center of each wall acted like a thick blanket, trapping still air and creating insulation values that no solid wood wall could match. By midnight, the differences became measurable. Johann woke briefly to add wood to his dying fire, noting that his breath was visible in the main room despite the earlier heating. The thermometer read 42 degrees. In the Cordwood house, Heinrich slept soundly as his walls continued releasing stored heat into the interior spaces, maintaining a temperature in the high 50s without additional fuel. The thermal mass of Heinrich's thick walls created what building scientists would later call a flywheel effect. During the evening hours, when the fire burned hot, the massive cordwood construction absorbed heat energy deep into the wall system. As the fire died down, this stored energy slowly radiated back into the living space, moderating temperature swings and extending the warmth long after the fuel was exhausted. At 6 o'clock in the morning, both men checked their thermometers with growing interest. Johann's reading showed 38 degrees, cold enough that frost had formed on the interior surfaces of his log walls, and his water bucket showed a thin skin of ice. Heinrich's main room held steady at 52 degrees, warm enough that his family had slept comfortably under normal bedding. The 40-pound fuel loads told an equally revealing story. Johann's stove had consumed most of its charge, leaving only a small bed of coals that provided no measurable heat. Heinrich's identical fuel load had burned more slowly and completely, the thick walls allowing the stove to operate more efficiently by retaining heat that would otherwise escape immediately through thin construction. Johann examined Heinrich's wall system with new respect, running his hand along the mortar joints that showed no signs of frost or condensation. "I have to admit, Heinrich, your walls held the heat better than mine. But explain to me how stacking firewood can outperform solid logs." Heinrich traced the cross-section of his wall with his finger. "The solid wood, it lets heat walk straight through, like a road for warmth to escape. But here, the heat must travel a crooked path, through wood, then mortar, then sawdust, then mortar again, then more wood. Much longer journey, much slower heat loss." Martha Brennan, who had initially dismissed the cordwood construction as folly, now studied the unusual walls with practical interest. "It's warmer in here than in our cabin, that's certain, and you use the same wood we burned. How much thicker are these walls than ours?" Your walls, 7 inches of pine log, Heinrich replied. Mine, 16 inches of log ends and sawdust insulation, more than twice as thick, but the insulation makes it work maybe 3 times better for holding heat. The test results spread quickly through the small community of homesteaders. Some neighbors attributed Heinrich's success to superior stove operation or straighter burning wood. Others suggested that the unusual wall construction might work for mild cold, but would surely fail when genuine winter arrived. But a few practical men began asking detailed questions about mortar mixtures, wall thickness, and the availability of short logs from the local mills. Johann remained skeptical but honest about what he'd observed. Your woodpile house kept warmer with the same fuel, Heinrich. I can't argue with the numbers, but October cold isn't January cold. We'll see how those walls perform when the real winter hits. Heinrich nodded, knowing that the modest test had revealed only a fraction of his wall's capabilities. The principles of thermal resistance and mass that governed his cordwood construction would prove far more valuable when Wisconsin's hard winter arrived to challenge every building method in the territory. But for now, the simple comparison had demonstrated what Canadian camp builders had learned through necessity, that stacking short logs with proper insulation could create walls that dramatically outperformed conventional frontier construction. As the neighbors returned to their morning routines, Heinrich quietly noted the frost-free interior surfaces of his cordwood walls and the comfortable temperature that required no immediate fire building. The first test had confirmed his unconventional choice, but the true validation lay months ahead in conditions that would separate adequate shelter from life-saving construction. The blizzard struck on October 15, 1880, 3 days earlier than the worst storm in Wisconsin's recorded history. Heinrich Müller woke to the sound of wind that seemed to tear at the earth itself, and when he peered through his single window, he saw nothing but white chaos. 3 feet of snow had fallen in 18 hours, and the temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero, the opening salvo of what would become known throughout the upper Midwest as the hard winter. Across the clearing, barely visible through the driving snow, Johann Brennan's chimney poured black smoke into the gray dawn. The conventional log cabins in the settlement had become islands in an ocean of white, their occupants burning wood at rates that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The railroad line to Green Bay had vanished under snowdrifts, cutting off coal shipments and leaving every family dependent entirely on the firewood they had cut and split during the brief autumn. By the third day of continuous storms, the differences between building methods became starkly apparent. Johann's 7-inch log walls, which had seemed adequate during mild October weather, now struggled against the relentless cold. Despite burning wood continuously, his interior temperature rarely climbed above 40 degrees during daylight hours. At night, even with the stove loaded and dampered, the cabin dropped into the 30s. Ice formed along the interior chinking, and condensation froze on the log surfaces wherever cold spots developed. Martha Brennan wrapped her children in every available blanket and quilt, but still they shivered through the nights. The family's carefully planned winter wood supply, 4 cords of split hardwood that should have lasted until March, was disappearing at an alarming rate. Johann found himself burning 3 times his normal daily allocation, and even then the cabin felt like an ice house with a small warm spot around the stove. The physics of heat loss worked mercilessly against thin-walled construction. Johann's logs, despite their solid appearance, conducted heat efficiently from the warm interior to the frigid exterior. The horizontal grain structure created pathways for thermal transfer, while gaps in the chinking allowed cold air to infiltrate and warm air to escape. Most critically, the limited thermal mass of 7-inch walls meant that heat energy passed through quickly rather than being stored and gradually released. Heinrich's cordwood house operated in an entirely different thermal environment. The 16-inch walls, with their complex matrix of wood ends, mortar joints, and sawdust insulation, created multiple barriers to heat transfer. The log ends forced heat to travel across the grain, the mortar provided thermal breaks, and the insulated core acted like a thick blanket wrapped around the entire structure. When Heinrich loaded his stove in the evening and allowed it to burn hot for several hours, the massive walls absorbed and stored enormous amounts of thermal energy. During the worst nights of the early blizzards, when outside temperatures reached 30 below zero, Heinrich's house maintained interior temperatures in the mid-40s without continuous firing. The thermal mass effect meant that heat absorbed during active burning periods continued radiating into the living space for hours after the fire died to coals. His family slept comfortably under normal bedding, while Johann's family huddled together fully clothed under multiple layers of quilts. The fuel consumption differences became critical as the storms continued week after week. Heinrich burned approximately 60% less wood than his neighbors, while maintaining significantly higher interior temperatures. His carefully constructed walls allowed him to heat the house thoroughly with one or two major firings per day, while Johann kept his stove loaded continuously and still achieved inferior results. Old Eric Larsen, whose small cabin sat on the exposed north side of the clearing, faced even worse conditions. His 6-inch log walls and minimal chinking proved completely inadequate against the sustained cold. By December, Eric was burning furniture and fence posts to supplement his dwindling wood supply. His interior temperature often dropped below freezing overnight, and ice regularly formed on his water bucket despite keeping the stove loaded. The Kowalski family, recent Polish immigrants who had built their cabin using traditional methods from their homeland, struggled with similar problems. Their thick mud chinking, which worked well in Poland's milder climate, cracked and fell out in the extreme temperature swings of the Wisconsin winter. Cold air poured through the gaps, making their small cabin nearly uninhabitable despite constant fires. As December turned into January with no let-up in the brutal weather, the settlement faced a crisis of survival. The railroad remained blocked by massive snowdrifts, some reaching 15 feet deep across the tracks. No coal shipments arrived, no supply trains brought food or materials, and families found themselves completely isolated with whatever resources they had stored before the storms began. Johann's woodpile, which had appeared more than adequate in September, shrank visibly each day. He began burning green wood and unseasoned pieces that produced more smoke than heat. His children developed persistent coughs from the poor air quality, and Martha complained that she could no longer feel her fingers even indoors during the coldest snaps. Heinrich watched his neighbors' struggles with growing concern. His own fuel consumption remained manageable. His thick walls meant that even during the worst cold snaps, he could maintain comfortable interior conditions with reasonable amounts of wood. But he could see smoke pouring constantly from every other chimney in the settlement, a sure sign that his neighbors were burning through their winter supplies at unsustainable rates. The temperature extremes of the hard winter tested every aspect of frontier construction. When the thermometer dropped to 40 below zero during one memorable January week, conventional log cabins became nearly uninhabitable. Families gathered around their stoves wearing full winter clothing, and even then they could not escape the bone-deep cold that penetrated thin walls and poor chinking. Heinrich's cordwood construction, however, continued to perform as the Canadian camp builders had promised. The massive walls absorbed heat during firing periods and released it gradually, maintaining interior temperatures that allowed normal indoor activities. His children played comfortably in shirt sleeves while neighbor children huddled under blankets just yards away. By February, the fuel crisis reached desperate proportions. Johann had burned through 5 cords of wood, more than his entire planned winter supply, and faced the terrifying prospect of running out completely with weeks of winter remaining. Eric Larsen had already begun dismantling interior partitions to feed his stove, and the Kowalski family talked quietly about abandoning their cabin for more substantial shelter. The hard winter's relentless assault had revealed the true cost of building thin walls in extreme climates. What seemed like adequate construction during mild weather proved dangerously inadequate when sustained cold tested every building method to its limits. Heinrich's unconventional cordwood walls, mocked as excessive just months earlier, now stood as the only truly comfortable shelter in a settlement of freezing neighbors. The crisis reached its breaking point on February 9, 1881, when the worst blizzard of the hard winter struck with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 35 below zero. Johann Brennan stood in his cabin doorway at dawn, staring at his nearly empty woodshed with the desperation of a man facing his family's destruction. His last 2 armloads of split wood would barely last through the day, and green timber lay buried under 8 feet of snow. Martha held their youngest child close to the failing stove, both wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight, despite burning their kitchen table and two chairs to keep the fire alive. Ice coated the interior walls wherever cold penetrated the inadequate chinking, and the children's breath formed visible clouds, even huddled directly beside the stove. "Johann," Martha whispered, her voice tight with fear, "we cannot last another night like this. The children are turning blue, even with the fire going." Across the clearing, barely visible through the driving snow, Heinrich's chimney showed only modest smoke, the telltale sign of efficient heating rather than desperate fuel consumption. Johann swallowed his pride and pulled on every piece of clothing he owned for the journey through waist-deep drifts to his neighbor's door. Heinrich opened the door to find Johann ice-covered and shivering violently. The warmth that immediately enveloped the freezing man came as a physical shock. Heinrich's main room maintained a temperature near 50 degrees despite the howling storm outside. The cordwood walls, invisible beneath their neat mortar faces, continued their steady release of stored thermal energy even as the blizzard raged. "Heinrich," Johann managed through chattering teeth, "I was wrong about your walls. Dead wrong. My family is freezing to death in our cabin, and I'm asking, begging, for shelter until this storm passes." Heinrich stepped aside without hesitation. "Bring Martha and the children. Bring blankets. My walls have room for all of us." Within an hour, 3 families crowded into Heinrich's Cordwood house. The Brennans, old Eric Larson, and the Kowalskis, whose cabin had become completely uninhabitable when their stovepipe froze and filled their single room with smoke. 14 people now depended on the thermal performance of walls that neighbors had mocked as an elaborate woodpile just months earlier. The house that had seemed spacious for Heinrich's family of 4 now bustled with refugees from conventional log construction, but the massive cordwood walls continued to perform exactly as the Canadian camp builders had promised. Heinrich loaded his stove with 60 pounds of split hardwood before bed, no more than he typically burned during severe cold, and dampered it for overnight heating. Throughout the night, as winds reached sustained speeds of 45 miles per hour and the outside temperature remained locked at 30 below zero, the Cordwood house maintained interior conditions that allowed normal sleep. The main room held steady near 48 degrees, while the back room farthest from the stove stayed above freezing. Children slept comfortably on straw ticks spread across the floor, and adults rested without the bone-deep cold that had made sleep impossible in thin-walled cabins. The thermal physics that governed Heinrich's success operated on principles that frontier builders rarely understood but could observe in practice. The 16-inch wall thickness created an R value of approximately 24, compared to the R8 of conventional log walls. This threefold improvement in thermal resistance meant that heat energy moved through Heinrich's walls at 1/3 the rate of his neighbor's construction. More importantly, the thermal mass of the cordwood walls, thousands of pounds of wood, mortar, and insulation, acted as a massive heat battery. During active firing periods, the walls absorbed enormous quantities of thermal energy deep into their structure. As the fire died down, this stored energy radiated slowly back into the living space, moderating temperature swings and extending warmth long after the fuel was exhausted. Johann, sleeping on the floor near the stove, marveled at the steady temperature throughout the long night. In his own cabin, the air temperature swung wildly from overheated near the fire to below freezing in corners and upper spaces. Heinrich's house maintained remarkably even conditions throughout its interior, a function of the thermal mass that absorbed heat spikes and filled temperature valleys. By morning, when outside temperatures had climbed to a relatively mild 20 below zero, the differences in fuel consumption told the complete story. Heinrich's single 60-pound charge of wood had heated a house containing 14 people more effectively than Johann's continuous feeding of his stove had warmed 4 people. The cordwood walls had extracted maximum value from every piece of fuel, while conventional construction wasted heat through rapid transfer to the exterior. Eric Larson, examining the interior wall surface with newfound respect, traced the neat mortar joints between log ends. "Heinrich, I owe you my life. But I need to understand what you built here. These walls look like stacked firewood, but they hold heat like nothing I've ever seen. Heinrich walked to the wall and placed his hand flat against the mortar surface. Feel here, Eric. The wall is warm all the way through, not just on the surface. When I fire the stove hot, the heat soaks deep into all this wood and mortar. Then it comes back out slowly, all night long. Your thin logs, they let the heat walk straight through to the outside. Martha Brennan, who had initially dismissed the Cordwood construction as wasteful eccentricity, now studied every detail of the unusual walls. How much thicker are these walls than our cabin, Heinrich? Your cabin walls, maybe 7 inches of solid log, Heinrich replied. These walls, 16 inches of log ends and sawdust insulation in the middle. Much thicker, but the sawdust is what makes them work so well, like wearing a thick wool coat instead of a thin cotton shirt. The Kowalski children, who had not been truly warm in weeks, played comfortably in their shirt sleeves while the blizzard continued outside. Their father Stefan examined the post and beam framing that supported the Cordwood Masonry, recognizing construction techniques from Central European traditions, but applied to materials abundant on the American frontier. In Poland, we build thick walls with stone and clay, Stefan observed. But here, no good stone, plenty of short wood from the mills. You took what the land gives you and made it work better than what we brought from the old country. As the storm finally began to weaken on its third day, the assembled families faced a stark comparison between building methods. 3 conventional log cabins sat cold and nearly uninhabitable, their thin walls no match for sustained extreme weather. One Cordwood house had sheltered 14 people in reasonable comfort, using less fuel than any single conventional cabin consumed while failing to protect its occupants. The numbers spoke with mathematical certainty. Heinrich's walls provided roughly 3 times the thermal resistance of conventional log construction while offering thermal mass that moderated temperature swings and extended heating efficiency far beyond what solid log walls could achieve. The difference between R24 and R8 had proved to be the difference between comfort and suffering, between efficient fuel use and desperate waste, between adequate shelter and life-threatening cold. Johann stood at Heinrich's window, watching smoke pour from his own distant chimney, where a small fire struggled to restore minimal warmth to his abandoned cabin. Heinrich, when this winter ends, I want to learn everything you know about building walls like these. Not just for me, for everyone in the settlement who wants to survive the next hard winter. Heinrich nodded quietly, knowing that the Canadian camp builders' techniques had finally found their vindication on the Wisconsin frontier. The spring thaw of 1881 revealed the full extent of the hard winter's devastation across the Wisconsin settlements. When the last snows melted in late April, Heinrich Müller walked among his neighbors' cabins and saw the toll that inadequate construction had taken on buildings and families alike. Johann Brennan's log walls showed deep checks and splits, where extreme temperature cycling had stressed the wood beyond its limits. The Kowalski cabin bore scars of desperation, interior walls stripped for fuel, damaged chinking that had failed during the worst cold, and a general air of structural fatigue. Heinrich's Cordwood house, by contrast, emerged from the brutal winter essentially unchanged. The post and beam frame had carried structural loads exactly as designed, while the thick masonry walls showed only minor mortar shrinkage that could be easily repaired with fresh lime pointing. The massive construction had absorbed months of thermal cycling without significant damage, proving that proper materials and techniques could withstand conditions that destroyed conventional frontier building methods. Johann approached Heinrich in early May with a proposition born of hard-won respect. Heinrich, I want to rebuild my barn using your wall method, and I want to learn everything you know about mixing that mortar and laying up those short logs. Will you teach me? The request marked the beginning of Cordwood construction's quiet spread across northern Wisconsin. Heinrich spent the summer of 1881 working alongside neighbors who had witnessed the thermal performance of thick walls during the crisis months. He taught Johann to cut 16-inch pieces from mill waste, to mix lime mortar with proper sand ratios, and to lay courses of log ends with consistent spacing and thickness. The techniques that Heinrich demonstrated had been refined through years of Canadian logging camp experience, but they adapted perfectly to Wisconsin conditions. Local mills generated enormous quantities of short offcuts that sold cheaply or were given away as waste. Limestone deposits near Green Bay provided lime for mortar. Sand from glacial deposits mixed readily with the lime to create durable pointing compounds. The abundant softwood forests offered cedar, tamarack, and hemlock in the precise lengths needed for cordwood construction. By 1883, 5 new stovewood buildings stood in the Door County area, 3 barns, a smokehouse, and Johann's new cabin built to Heinrich's specifications. Each structure featured the same basic elements: post and beam framing for structural support, 16-inch log ends laid perpendicular to the wall face, lime mortar applied only to interior and exterior faces, and sawdust and lime insulation filling the central cavity. Word of the thermal performance spread through informal networks of farmers, immigrants, and practical builders who valued observed results over architectural fashion. Stefan Kowalski, whose family had nearly frozen in their conventional cabin, built a new house in 1884 using cordwood techniques learned from Heinrich. The thick walls and efficient heating allowed the family to cut their fuel consumption by more than half while maintaining comfortable interior conditions throughout Wisconsin's notoriously harsh winters. The method attracted particular interest among German and Polish immigrants who recognized similarities to European building traditions, but appreciated the adaptation to American materials and conditions. These settlers brought masonry skills from their homelands and understood the value of thermal mass in cold climates, making them natural adopters of cordwood techniques that combined familiar principles with abundant local resources. Heinrich's influence extended beyond individual building projects to the gradual establishment of cordwood construction as a recognized regional practice. He developed standardized specifications for wall thickness, mortar composition, and log preparation that could be reliably replicated by builders with basic skills. His methods emphasized careful attention to moisture management, proper curing of mortar joints, and protection of log ends from direct weather exposure. The success of early cordwood buildings led to more ambitious projects as builders gained confidence with the techniques. In 1895, a significant cordwood house was completed in Door County, featuring all 4 exterior walls built entirely of short log masonry. The structure demonstrated that the method could handle full residential construction, not merely agricultural buildings or simple shelters. John Mekachalski, a Polish immigrant who had observed the thermal advantages of thick walls during his early years in Wisconsin, commissioned an ambitious stovewood commercial building around 1899. The Mekachalski General Store, saloon, and boarding house combined retail, entertainment, and lodging functions in a substantial 2-story structure built primarily of 18-inch cedar chunks laid in lime mortar. The building's success as both a commercial venture and an architectural achievement proved that cordwood techniques could meet the demands of public construction. The Mekachalski building represented the full maturation of techniques that Heinrich had introduced 2 decades earlier. The walls featured careful attention to drainage, properly proportioned mortar mixes, and protection details that ensured long-term durability. The interior spaces maintained comfortable temperatures year-round with minimal heating costs, validating the thermal principles that had saved lives during the hard winter. By the turn of the 20th century, more than 60 stovewood structures dotted Wisconsin, concentrated particularly in Door County and surrounding areas where Heinrich's influence had been strongest. The buildings included houses, barns, commercial structures, and specialized buildings like smokehouses and root cellars. Each represented an application of thermal principles that prioritized performance over appearance, efficiency over convention. The spread of cordwood construction created a distinctive regional building tradition that historians would later recognize as uniquely American folk architecture. The method combined European masonry traditions with frontier pragmatism, Canadian logging camp techniques with German immigrant craftsmanship. Most importantly, it demonstrated that innovative builders could achieve superior performance by understanding thermal principles and adapting construction methods to local materials and climate conditions. Heinrich Müller, now recognized as the pioneer who had introduced life-saving building techniques to Wisconsin settlements, continued to refine and teach cordwood methods until his death in 1908. His legacy lived on in dozens of buildings that continued to provide efficient, comfortable shelter long after conventional log cabins of the same era had succumbed to decay and structural failure. The cordwood tradition that Heinrich established would eventually attract the attention of 20th century researchers who sought to understand why these unusual walls performed so effectively. But for the farmers and immigrants who built them, scientific validation mattered less than practical results. They had learned through direct observation that stacking short logs with proper insulation created walls that held heat 3 times more effectively than conventional construction, using materials that cost little and techniques that any careful builder could master. In the end, Heinrich's woodpile walls had proven their worth not through architectural theory, but through winter survival, demonstrating that practical innovation often emerged from necessity rather than formal training, and that the best building methods were those that worked when failure meant death.